My name is Moria Amit, and I'm the Senior Genealogy Librarian here at the Center for Jewish History. This is the first program in the 2020 Family History Today series. I do plan to have an entire lineup of monthly programs this year, so please stay tuned to our website, genealogy.cjh.org. For those of you who are not familiar with the Center for Jewish History, we are a collaborative home for 5 partner organizations that together form the largest archive of the modern Jewish experience outside of Israel. The Center's Genealogy Institute, which is where I'm based, provides access to a wealth of genealogical resources through its reference library, its online databases, research guides, and our expert referrals to relevant documents and books in the Center's partner collections. At the Institute, we strive to make family history research accessible to researchers of all ages, abilities, and levels of experience, whether Jewish or non-Jewish. And we operate much like a public library, so that means that you're welcome to come in whenever we're open. You don't need to make an appointment, and we're open free of charge. During our open hours, our skilled staff and volunteers are always on hand. If you're unable to come in person, you're also welcome to send us questions by phone or by email. And lastly, we offer a variety of educational opportunities from this Family History Today series to our free workshops for groups from New York City area schools, senior centers, and religious or nonprofit organizations. So if you belong to one of those groups and you're interested in setting up such a workshop, please feel free to reach out to us at any point. And for basic information about the Genealogy Institute, including our hours and contact information, please pick up one of our flyers in the back of the room. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about the Genealogy Institute at the end of this program. So before we get started, I just wanted to mention a few basic policies. So please go ahead, and now is the time to silence your devices. Thank you. You are welcome, however, to take photos of any slides here tonight. This program will be recorded, so please, when it comes time for the question and answer period, please speak into a microphone, and we'll be passing one around. And on that point as well, please hold all of your questions to the end of this presentation. Okay, so about the presenter that you're about to hear tonight. Andrew Zalewski is a former professor of medicine at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. He is vice president of Gesher Galicia, a nonprofit organization devoted to genealogical and historical research on Galicia. Andrew is a frequent speaker at meetings of Jewish genealogical societies and cultural and academic institutions in the US and abroad, and he has authored 2 books on Austrian Galicia, including Galician Trails, The Forgotten Story of One Family, and Galician Portraits in Search of Jewish Roots. So please join me in welcoming Andrew Zalewski. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Moray. Thank you for all the preparations, and we've exchanged more than a dozen emails before this event happened, so thank you. I'm joined also today by Dr. Stephen Turner, president of Gesher Galicia, and René Steinig, long-term member of Gesher Galicia and board member, who is a moderator of our digital discussion group that we discuss not only Galician themes, but also, I guess, other themes. And of course, is with us Charles Katz, who is a treasurer of Gesher Galicia. So welcome again. I'm delighted to be here in Center for Jewish History. I think this is one of my favorite places in New York. In fact, anytime I'm in New York, I try to visit the room just above us, the wonderful reading room where I see Moriah and see how this place contributes to a richness of Jewish culture, history, but also to our genealogical pursuits. So over the next 45 minutes, I would like you to explore with me a group of Jewish men who would find themselves far away from home and would meet those men startled with unfamiliar sights and unfamiliar sounds. And many of them, as you will see, will cross many countries and we'll travel a little bit with them. Then we'll advance 2 centuries. We can do this in a talk. We can move from century to century. And I'd love to introduce to you a few Jewish barber surgeons from Austrian Galicia who would become surgeons and medically trained physicians. And many of them with university diploma at hand would be challenging their own communities. And I would think that many of them would deserve the name of medical rebels, causing controversies and debates. And lastly, we'll move to 20th century, but it would be a turn of Jewish women. And this is the topic that for sure we can spend more than an hour discussing, but today you will discuss a few fascinating Jewish women who not only pursue their own educational career, but also change dramatically the families and the society around them. So we'll be traveling from country to country, from continent to continent, but also from century to century. Well, I hope you also will agree with me that we all face dilemma whenever we talk about Jewish history, Jewish culture, or in our case, Jewish genealogy. We face this tremendous dilemma. How far back should we start? I mean, this is very rich history, spanning centuries. So for purpose of our discussion, I want us to start today in the 12th century, in the Middle Ages, in Europe. This is the time when Jewish doctors from Islamic world travel through Spain and begin to settle first in south of France. Later on, they will move to Germany. And this is a very peculiar time as far as medicine is concerned. Medicine is held in extremely low esteem in a society of 12th, 13th century. Medicine is considered a repetitious craft that you learn through apprenticeship, is based not on any principle, but based what you learn on a corner of this city, or corner of this street or another. And yet, despite the fact that the medical craft is held toward the bottom of all the professions, Jewish physicians stood apart. And in fact, you see here, with a healthy dose of exaggeration, statement of one of Jewish physician who, like his brethren, would arrive in Europe carrying with him not only experience moving from town to town, but also what collectively we would call the Hebrew medical library. Jews, not Gentiles, knew Arabic. And through the knowledge of Arabic, they could translate Arabic text, medical text. They could also revive the knowledge surrounding the old Greek text. And this is one of the translations you can see written in this wonderful Sephardic script by the man who here wrote in the introduction again the statements about the Jewish physicians standing apart from their more parochial, if you will, Christian counterparts. Well, Kraków was a capital of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and it was no exception that in 15th and 16th century, Kraków witnessed arrival of also foreign-born physicians. They were Sephardic physicians. Isaac Hispanuk was first. He arrived just a few years after Jewish expulsion from Spain in 1492 and became a royal physician to 3 monarchs in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Another one to whom we'll come back in a moment was Salomon Kalahora, who arrived through Amsterdam to Kraków and would set deeper roots in Kraków and in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. A few decades later, Italian-born Queen Bona brought to Kraków and Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, this time Italian-born Jewish surgeons. And of course, rich and famous of the day, if they could afford, quite often would also find and hire foreign-born physicians. But nothing is static. Jewish doctors with their knowledge, experience, and Hebrew medical library wanted to taste something new that is beginning to develop starting in 12th century in Europe. Medicine is slowly changing from, again, apprenticeship that I mentioned to you, to the discipline that is being taught in medieval universities. This is the process that started in 12th century. You will be surprised, was not finished until the end of 18th or beginning of 19th century. But there were two obstacles that Jews witnessed and faced, if you will, trying to enter this new arena of medieval university. This is the picture of the first university in Italy, the Bologna University. Well, one obstacle that they faced was from within. Jews spoke Yiddish, maybe a little bit of the language of the host country where they lived. Certainly, they did not converse in Latin, and Latin was the language of the university. The leadership of their communities looked with certain suspicion at studying of philosophy. Philosophy was required to study medicine, philosophy with explanation of natural philosophy, natural laws. Very easily you could see that bringing this type of knowledge back to their own community could be in contrast, in conflict with the prevailing views within Jewish communities. But I would say these are rather minor obstacles. A major obstacle was that medieval universities were in the hands of the Catholic Church, and multiple pronouncements of Catholic Church. This is one from the Council of Basel from the beginning of 15th century, effectively barred Jews from attending medieval universities and attaining academic degrees. But there was one bright exception, University of Padua. You are looking here at Palazzo del Bo, which stands still today. Palazzo del Bo was the home of a college of jurists, training lawyers, but also college of artists, training, among others, medics. University of Padua was a bright exception in the sea of intolerance of medieval university because it accepted Jewish students from the beginning of 15th century, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries. More than several hundreds of Jewish students attended Padua University. The reason for that was that university was under control of Venetian Republic. Venetian Republic was a mercantile republic. They wanted to trade with everyone. So ambassadors from Venice spread throughout Europe, and not only Europe, through countries around the Mediterranean Sea, would proclaim to everyone, we are open for business. We are also open for business by taking your youth into the ranks of student body within the university. So here you see several names of Jewish men, Jewish students who arrived from Kraków, from Galician Jerusalem by the name Brody, in future Galicia, from Lithuania, from Vilnius, and of course from Lwów, that we will visit in a moment. Imagine this cultural shock of those young men arriving with, as I mentioned before, knowledge of Yiddish, maybe a few Polish words, a few German words, and then surrounded by cacophony of foreign languages. In its heydays, Padua University was home to 4,000 to 5,000 students from all over Europe. These young men met other Jews, Ashkenazim, Sephardim. They met Gentiles from France, England, Dutch Republic, Germany, from Ottoman Empire, and so forth and so on. So one cannot imagine greater cultural shock. Now, you are looking here at the anatomical theater. When I look at this picture, I cannot resist thinking about those young men standing shoulder in shoulders with their other counterparts here in this round, circular anatomical theater, listening to the lecture delivered in Latin. And maybe after lecture, they cross the street, essentially, yes, 1 or 2 streets, to the Jewish ghetto where they could enjoy kosher lunch. And maybe in the afternoon, they wandered through the streets of Padua, peeking through the open doors, seeing those beautiful sculptures of Renaissance or paintings being created in this place. Again, cultural shock. Well, when the Jewish students were ready to graduate, they received diplomas. This is a copy of one of such diplomas. And when they returned home, this very unique group of men would be given back in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and in Germany these honorific titles to distinguish them as a university-trained physicians from other healthcare professionals present in this busy marketplace, wise women, barber surgeons that we will be talking about, and even Kabbalistic healers that were prevalent in 18th century. Well, let me show you one of the graduates from Padua University, since we are talking about medical globetrotters. So Joseph Salomon del Medico was born on an island of Crete in Mediterranean. He went to Padua University in Italy. One of his teachers was Galileo Galilei. I think this is a pretty good teacher to have. After that, he returned to Crete, where Del Medico collected, as was said, a library of about 2,000 manuscripts. Incredible. But the island was too small for his mind, so he would then move to Egypt, where he engaged in a debates with Arabic mathematicians on some mathematical formulas. Then he moved to Constantinople, today's Istanbul, which he called Constantinople as a mother and father of all learning. I like this phrase, mother and father of all learning. Then, while in Constantinople, he received invitation from a magnate family from Lithuania, where he would spend next 8 years, and he writes this in his letter, spending entire days traveling in a coach from one village to another, attending medical needs, and he complains, like in today we would complain, I have no time for anything else. Well, he had a little bit of time. He met with the Polish astronomers at that time that were in Kraków, in other places. And while busy seeing those patients, Del Medico would write the manuscript that would be later published in Amsterdam, in which he introduces to the Jewish world Copernican theory, that it's not an earth, but the sun within our solar system. Well, after 8 years, he became a rabbi physician in Hamburg. Then he moved for a few years to Amsterdam. And then, if that was not enough, moved to Prague, where he died in the mid-17th century. I think you agree with me that even if we look through the prism of 21st century, that is quite a lot of travel to have during your lifetime. Well, after Padua University, an Italian university, Leiden University in the Dutch Republic started to admit Jewish students. And then in the 18th century, German universities began slowly, as you could see, open their doors to admit Jewish students. For Jews from Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, particularly Frankfurt University and Halle University would be important. Many Jews, until the beginning of 19th century, would venture to those German universities to get surgical or medical degrees. Now, I mentioned to you Sephardic physician Salomon Kalahora, who arrived in the 16th century in Kraków. This is an abbreviated list of this medical dynasty of Kalahoras. I want to mention only one, Aran Caracola, that we are very proud in Gesher, Galicia, because we discovered this very unique record. This is a part of our project of studying Jewish physicians in various locations and various universities. This is the document found in a city archives of Kraków, where 3 professors of Jagiellonian University provided written testimony that Aaron Kalahora is fit to practice his medical profession in the city. This is probably the first written document about the Jewish doctor who is admitted by professors to practice medicine at the time when the universities and Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or Habsburg universities were still closed to Jewish students. But you begin to see that the doors are being pried open. Very special record indeed, from the beginning of 18th century. Let's move to Lwów. We will visit Lwów just in a few minutes, an important town, city for our discussion. There we meet the Jonah family, who had this not Jewish-sounding name because the place where they were from in France. You could see here 3 generations of the Jonah physicians. All of them were graduates of Padua University. Emmanuel Di Jonah, in fact, was not only a royal physician, but became also a president of pan-communal Jewish assembly called the Council of Four Lands that appropriated taxes due to the royal treasury, but also council was responsible for resolving intercommunal disputes. So again, you begin to see the interest of Jewish medics in the civic affairs of their community, the Jonah family from Lwów. Well, that brings me to year 1772. Year 1772 is important for our discussion because this is the year where Austrian Galicia is being carved out from the map of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You see here a lithograph where 3 monarchs of Russia, Prussia, and Habsburg monarchy are here carving their areas of influence from the map of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Habsburg monarchy, or Austria, would receive the largest portion in the south of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that will be renamed as Austrian Galicia. In May and June of 1772, this territory would be seized by Habsburg troops with no difficulty. I love this map. This is one of the earliest maps of Austrian Galicia. You could see how still primitive is this map. It's a handwritten map. And there are more than 200 maps of Galicia on our website that you could view at your leisure. But this one is very, very special. It's one of the very first. Well, just to orient you, where was this Galicia? We are not talking about Spanish Galicia. If you are looking for Spanish Galicia, you're in a wrong room. This is Galicia that joined in 1772 this multi-ethnic large Austrian empire. To the north and to the east, it was later on surrounded by the lands belonging to the Russian Empire, and to the south and to the west by other provinces of Habsburg monarchy or Austrian Empire. Of course, today, Galicia is split into 2 parts. Its western part is within the borders of Poland. Its eastern part is within the borders of independent Ukraine. So let me now introduce to you a few Jewish barber surgeons. And we'll talk also about those medical rebels, maybe not with guns, but with their pen and with their ideas. Another map, this is the map of Lwów. Lwów in the eastern part of Galicia became the capital of newly formed Austrian Galicia in September of 72. You see the city, you see the surrounding area, you see also other names. Lwów in Polish, Lemberg in German, and Lviv in Ukraine. This is today's name of this wonderful place. Leopolis was in Latin. Well, one of the first things that Austrian administrators did, they sent a medical mission to this newly discovered but wild, if you will, province. And it became very quickly that the healthcare situation, and it's surprising that they debated healthcare situation, at that time. Not only we can debate healthcare situation today. What this medical mission discovered very quickly, yes, there were few physicians there, but none of them could show any diplomas, any credentials. Most care was delivered by barber surgeons, again, apprenticeship system where you learn certain craft besides trimming the beard, besides shaving the chins, besides trimming the hairs. You also could, as a barber surgeon, perform minor surgical procedures, set broken bones, removed decaying teeth, and so forth and so on. Well, vast majority of barber surgeons, not only in Lemberg, but also in entire Galicia, would be Jewish. But again, the problem is the same. Yes, they are delivering this care, but they have a difficulty proving that they learned this craft somewhere. So approximately, almost exactly, in fact, a year after Lemberg became capital of Austrian Galicia, the local governor issued these regulations opening lessons, teaching, learning of medical craft, surgical craft, and midwifery. These are free courses that would last for 3 years, and then they will culminate in examination, and if successful, the students would become properly certified medical professionals. So this is a precursor, if you will, of the university. At that time, there was no university in Lemberg. A few years later, one of the Austrian bureaucrats would be writing to Vienna, and certainly he's not friend of Jews, based on how he writes about Jews, that the courses were not really very well attended. These were for free courses. But there is one group that stood apart that enthusiastically signed up for the courses. They bought books. They even hired private teachers. These were those Jewish barber surgeons who wanted to get credentials. And in fact, 10 years later, about 60 diplomas would be issued by this precursor university, with only 2 given to the Christian students. The rest were, again, Jewish students. Again, you see, whenever there is opportunity to learn, Jewish students would be trying to seize this opportunity.
Jewish mothers wanted their sons to be that.
This is another unique document as a part of our research project on Jewish students from Galicia. You can see picking here from 1779. We are very proud because we found this forgotten in one of the libraries in Lwów. This is the list of Jewish surgeons deployed to different towns in Galicia. And if you look very closely at the names, you could see that these names are still recorded in an old traditional patronymic format. Jews adopted permanent surnames as we know them today only 9 years later in 1788. So again, with the research, with the documents, we could penetrate perhaps this brick wall that very often as genealogists you face when you want to transition from the permanent surnames to the patronymic format. Again, this would be most likely graduates of this initial course. Well, in 1780, Joseph II became the sole emperor of Habsburg monarchy, and I call this that this will be a roller coaster decade. I'm sure our ancestors in Galicia had plenty things to talk about. Joseph II was offender of everything and everyone. Many of his Jewish rulings and edicts were progressive, others were coercive. One good ruling was in 1782. Joseph II decided that Jews from now on should be admitted to all the universities. In fact, he stated to somewhat reluctant Vienna University that duly certified Jews should not be prevented from exercising their art, their profession. And here, through our research again, we can find when first Jewish students would graduate from different universities throughout Habsburg monarchy. Lemberg University opened 2 years later in 1784, and in 1786, we see first Jewish surgeon graduating now from Lemberg University. In 1804, you will see in a moment the first Jewish doctor will graduate. There were 2 medical degrees at the time, lower of surgeon and higher than of medical doctor. Then Prague, Vienna, and again, we'll come back to Jagiellonian University. So you could see that the progress would be clearly unstoppable once the universities opened. Another map of new capital of Galicia, Lemberg. This one is from the turn of the centuries between 18th and 19th century. You could see that the center city is still surrounded by the thick defensive walls from the past times. The new university was in this corner, in the northwestern corner. And again, if we look at the first records, or the records from first years of the university, we find few, not too many, but few Jewish students. So these are real trailblazers, or pioneers, if you will. Here we find Moses Clar. Moses Clar became first lawyer trained in Lemberg, Jewish lawyer trained in Lemberg University, graduating in 1802. He was from Stanisławów, the third largest city in Galicia. Here is the record that I initially missed. Only on the second time I recognized the name of Jacob Rappaport. He would become the first medical doctor graduating from Lemberg University in 1804. Well, when you look at this panoramic view of Lemberg, it's quite obvious that passing the law, opening the university to Jewish students, not necessarily meant from the beginning their full acceptance. So it's worth to look in the context of this place at some documents that could tell us a little bit how those first few Jewish students, how they felt in that place. Well, this is a document that we found in 1808. It is a document signed by Wolf Barth and Moses Arts, 2 Jewish students of surgery. They are about a year. They have one more year of studies of surgery. They will be graduating in 1 year, and they petition university for a permission to stay where they lived for the past few years, not far away from the university. Well, the university has no problem. The issue is that they are residing not in a place that Jews are allowed to reside. So here university answers, trying to be a little bit helpful, saying, well, they write this comment to the municipal government of Lemberg. Maybe you could register them not as Jews, but register them as students. Well, bureaucracy worked fast in many cases. Here is the answer within a few days that says no. There are no exceptions to imperial edicts as far as the residence of Jewish inhabitants of Lemberg is concerned. But there are some also positive news. This is another document by coincidence from the same year. This is an incredible document. This is a public campaign against Jewish surgeons. This is signed by many surgeons, pharmacists, and even one veterinarian I found among the signatures, Christian medics, who are petitioning university again, saying, quote, with tears in our eyes, we witness arrival of Jewish surgeons to our towns, end quote. This will ruin us economically. Therefore, they say, you should create a new form of examination for those Jewish barber surgeons who want to enter university and become university-trained medics, because for sure they must be falsifying some school records. And we are dying economically because they are coming to our towns. Well, this time, university clearly decided on the sides of Jewish students, answering there will be no exceptions for Jewish students in terms of creating more obstacles to their admission. So I find this incredible petition, if you will. I mentioned Jacob Rappaport. So this is his picture. This is the record that you remember from before. He graduated in 1804 as a first medic from Lemberg University, higher medical degree, and became a very successful physician in the capital city, crossing ethnic and religious boundaries, very successful among Gentiles, among Jews, highly respected. In fact, this was the best therapy, cure, if you will, for prevailing anti-Semitism. In 1930s, Galician population had a lot to talk about. Today we talk about the coronavirus outbreak. They talked about the cholera epidemics. Cholera epidemics was arriving from Russia, and in 1831 swept through entire Galicia. As you could see, within few months, entire Galicia would be under the threat of this deadly disease. Jacob Rappaport from Lemberg was empowered by local authorities to organize defense of this capital city against this disease. His reports about cholera would be published within few months in medical journals across Europe. In fact, I found some reference even from the following year from United States, quoting Rappaport's work. Now, remember, this is at the time when Jews don't have a full political or civil rights. And yet, this Galician doctor is heard across Europe. Here are some statistics, if you will. A year later, in 1832, passengers would bring cholera to North America and South America. But even more important than his participation in a defense against cholera epidemic was Rappaport's interest in a religious reform. This is the list of members of Jewish community who met in a private home in October of 1840 and decided that it's time to build in Lemberg maybe a new synagogue. They called this German Jewish prayer house, later renamed as Progressive Synagogue. If you look very closely at this list of physicians, lawyers, merchants, people kind of from different walks of life, the first name here is of that of Jacob Rappaport. It was said later that without Rappaport's support, this project would have been delayed for many, many years. This is the building of Progressive Synagogue that opened to big fanfare in 1846. On a personal note, my grandfather was a member of this congregation during the interwar period in Lwów. Another panoramic view of city of Lemberg. You could see many more buildings. This is a capital city. There is a building boom. In 1815, I will link this in a moment, this date, the city counted about 42,000 people. Among them, about 15,000 or 35% Jews. Jewish population, majority of them, we would call them today Orthodox. At that time, nobody used the phrase Orthodox, but traditional Jews. And yet you begin to see some signs of change. Some changes were brought by those medics trained in university. Some changes were brought by merchants coming from abroad. They slowly begin to develop different sense of aesthetics. They develop interest in literature and other pursuits that traditionally stayed outside Jewish community. That brings me to Isaac Erter. I know that Stephen Turner has an interest in a little town in Sędziszów, in the center of Galicia. Erter was born not far away from there, about 80 miles from Sędziszów. Both communities, Sędziszów and the community where Isaac Erter were born, were a very simple Hasidic communities. And yet, as you will see, Erter's life was all but Hasidic. In 1815, he arrives or 1813, he arrives to Lwów. He earns his living by giving lessons in Hebrew to children of rich merchants, but turns out that he's teaching them more than Hebrew. In fact, he faces the threat of Ben, threat of excommunication by Chief Rabbi Ornstein. Erter and his colleagues are accused of teaching young kids not only Hebrew, but also teachings of Moses Mendelssohn, the beauty of German literature, and you can imagine the controversies in a community. The ban is averted, but Erter falls on hard times, and he takes to pen, becoming one of the most popular Jewish writers. And you can see he writes in Hebrew, and in fact he is credited with the revival of Hebrew language for the literary purposes. This is one of his first books that he takes a clearly serious swipe at Chief Rabbi of Lemberg. And it's written as a beautiful satirical novel. Well, he decides to become a doctor relatively late in his life. In his 30s, he travels together with many, many Jews to Pest University, our database in this project that I mentioned to you about Jewish dentists, doctors, surgeons, midwives, include many who traveled to Pest University or Budapest in Hungary today to get this education. And here is the graduation record from 1830 when Isaac Erter becomes a university qualified or trained physician, surgeon physician. He returns to Brody, where he continues to write, and this is probably his most popular book that would be widely read in Jewish community, translated from Hebrew even to Yiddish to make it more understandable. This is the book where he, as you know by now, he writes in a satirical style. He doesn't spare anyone. Now he takes a swipe at tax farmers, community leaders that he feels take advantage of common people. But he even does not spare his learned colleagues who said they hide behind all these volumes of books and words that nobody understands, rather than taking care of their patients. He's talking about his fellow doctors, physicians. So again, not only medic, but as you could see, someone who definitely ruffled feathers of many, so medical rebel. Moritz Rappaport, the last profile that I want to show you, was very different than two others. No connection with Jacob Rappaport. He came from a very wealthy family from Lemberg. His father sent him relatively early to Vienna to gain education, and only at, I would say, stern letters from his father, he would enroll to study medicine. Rappaport's interest was literature, poetry, but he is coming from a Jewish family, very practical approach to life. You can't make money on poetry. Like Erter, he would go to Pest University. He would graduate as a medical doctor from Pest University. This is what we discovered in Pest. This is his doctoral dissertation with the signatures and views of all the professors who examined Moritz Rappaport. And he returns to his native city of Lemberg. In due course, he would become chief physician at Jewish Hospital of Lemberg. But more important for us is his interest outside medicine. He, as I mentioned, is very interested in poetry. He would become one of the most highly acclaimed poets writing in German, highly acclaimed in a German-speaking Europe. He writes on multiple topics, and topics that traverse cultural boundaries. This is, to me, very, very interesting. Just one example here. This is a poem written a little bit later called Bajazzo. It's written in the aftermath of the failed Polish uprising against the rule of Russians in a neighboring Russian Poland. And here you have a Galician Jew who is writing in German, who expresses his sympathy and sorrow for a defeat of his ethnic Poles. The phrase that you see here, to be both a Pole and a Jew is a double crown of melancholy, would be repeated many, many times by many Galician Jews throughout 19th century, again, reflecting a struggle where to find your place. Moritz Rappaport would be experimenting with these cultural connections in many other books, and this is just one example, another example of the theatrical play where he writes in German again about this legendary love affair between a Polish king and this beautiful daughter of impoverished tailor near Kraków. Again, exploration of multicultural milieu. Talking about Kraków, let's move from Lemberg to the western part of Galicia, to Kraków. Kraków was off and on within Austrian Galicia, but first time it joined Habsburg monarchy in 1796. If you visit Kraków, it's a wonderful city with the Renaissance style preserved old town, and probably 2 blocks. This is the market square. There is a university, Jagiellonian University. Jagiellonian University is the second oldest university in Central Europe. In fact, Galicianers very often proudly were telling people from Vienna, our university is older by 1 year than the famous Vienna University. For us, it's important that Jagiellonian University, established in 1364, was established on a street that was originally occupied by Jews in 1364. Well, Jagiellonian University would be slower than Lemberg in accepting Jews. Again, our project on Jewish medics indicates that the first Jewish students whom we can find is Solomon Wolff. Wolff studies surgery, becomes a surgeon, university-trained surgeons. These are some of the university records. I want to show you this record because we are talking also about genealogy, and you can find in those academic records plenty of genealogy information. This is a letter written to the university by the mayor of a little town where Solomon Wolff was growing up. The mayor says, well, Solomon is a boy of good moral standing. He didn't cause any troubles. And he says his father, that he gives the name, is also a physician. So again, you can extract from academic records a lot of information, not only about student, but also about his and later on her family. As far as the medical doctors, so higher medical degree at that time, again, Jagiellonian is lagging, as I mentioned, behind Lemberg. You remember in Lemberg it was 1804, Jacob Rappaport. In Jagiellonian, the first Jews who would attain the higher medical degrees were 2 Jews, Joseph Oettinger and Jonathan Warschauer, in 1843. Again, some records on Joseph Oettinger from his final examinations. And again, opinions of his professors. And this is an interesting, again, document that relates to genealogy. This is a handwritten petition of Joseph Oettinger. You can see his signature at the bottom. He's requesting the rector of the university to grant him a diploma of a doctor of medicine, which was granted the following date. So isn't that thrilling if you have a family member who studied to find a hand signature? This is a picture of Joseph Oettinger, not only a physician, not only a future head of Jewish hospital in Kraków, but also someone who was deeply involved in civic affairs of Kraków. He wanted to bring more education to Jewish community of Kraków, very active in, again, municipal life of the city. But as I'm showing you those first student here, first student there, I also want to stress one thing, that looking at those records, this is the story of not only of who is the first, who is the famous, who wrote this book or that book. It is a story about common people. So let me show you from our database about 3,500 Jewish students studying at different universities, just one common person, Samuel Hacker. You learn from the records where he was born, when he was born. Importantly for genealogists, you will learn the names and very often professions of the parents. Well, here, Samuel sounds like he was a troublemaker because in 1893, he was expelled from Jagiellonian for a socialist conspiracy. Here, he just traveled further east to the next city of Lemberg, where he enrolled in Lemberg University, but something didn't go well there either, because he returns to Jagiellonian, but never graduates. I present this on purpose because I'm still waiting for the time when I give those talks that somebody will raise the hand and saying, I know Samuel Hacker. I know what is the secret behind the socialist conspiracy. Well, let me finish this talk talking about women. Incredible story. I hope you will agree at the end. Not only from point of view of seizing the opportunity to improve your own life, but also women, Jewish women in particular, would change the structure of their own families, but often, as you will see, had a deep impact on a community and society around. Let's start our discussion about women with Rosa Welt. Rosa Welt and her three sisters, 4 girls, were born in a city of Czernowitz. This is a capital of Bukowina. Bukowina is adjacent province to Galicia, but think about cousins. For many decades, Bukowina and Galicia were connected administratively. In fact, Bukowina was governed from Lwów for more than half a century. Many Jews from Bukowina, in fact, like the Welt family, had roots among the Galician Jews. Rosa came from a very simple family. Her father was a broker who dealt with the contracts in flour, to supply bakers and maybe send flour somewhere else. He had no education, but he was literally obsessed to give his 4 daughters education. And he writes, or the writing about him indicates that he was becoming agitated when somebody was suggesting that his girls should learn those nice subjects. He says, no, I want my girls to learn exactly the same subjects as the boys are learning at school. Well, Rosa, in 1874, becomes one of the very first women in Austro-Hungary to graduate from gymnasium. So in theory, with the diploma from gymnasium, think about high school and junior college, something mixture of this. In theory, she is qualified to be admitted to university. She and her father traveled in 1874 to Vienna. There is even some story in a press in Vienna that here we have a first woman who wants to become a student of medicine. But Rosa is denied admission, not because she is Jewish, but because she is a woman. She is denied admission. In fact, some of the professors, you might find this incredible, would say, well, it is unbecoming for a young lady to be among men, to study such an intimate subject that can come up with medical studies. Well, as you will discover, Rosa will seldom take no for the answer. And she would travel to Switzerland. Switzerland is very permissive as far as women's admissions to universities since 1860s, women are admitted to Swiss universities, particularly foreign-born women. And Rosa enrolls in 1874 in Bern University, and 4 years later, here is her doctoral dissertation, becomes the very first woman in the entire Austro-Hungarian Empire to leave the university as a medical doctor. Well, with diploma in hand, she returns to Vienna. She wants to be eye doctor. There is a famed eye clinic in Vienna. But again, the story repeats itself. She is not admitted because she's a woman. You could see some headlines in the newspapers. They called them Rosa and her sisters as Latin girls because they had to study Latin. Despite all these positive headlines, Rosa is not admitted. Well, you know what she will do. She will leave. I think you recognize the place. She comes to this little place called New York. In August of 1880, she arrives on SS Nevada. This is a picture of Lower Manhattan. She, from the very first year, she would become a teacher, lecturer at Mount Sinai Hospital Nursing School. And more importantly, from the same year, she also becomes a clinical assistant in then famed New York Ophthalmic and Oral Institute. This is a document or set of documents that we discovered in Columbia University. This institute doesn't exist anymore. And here, if we look very closely, we find Roosevelt's name. We even can find the place, address on a 51st Street on the east side where Rosa lived. She had quite a long walk from 51st Street all the way down to near Wall Street, where the institute was located. Things are going fantastic for Rosa. She finally studies ophthalmology, eye disease. 2 years later, in 1882, she marries this wonderful man, Louis Strauss. Louis Strauss was described as a gregarious man from Brooklyn. He loved music. The couple would travel back and forth to Europe. A lovely life. They have one child, Nellie. Louis Strauss is a broker. He deals with the mining contracts. But the good life comes to a crashing end in 1907. It turns out that Louis Strauss ran Ponzi schemes. He defrauded his investors. And when the detectives knock on the Strauss's house, door of Strauss's house in Manhattan, he swallows large dose of cyanide and commits suicide in front of his wife. Wife is interrogated by police. How is it possible that such an amount of poison is kept at home? She's embroiled in multiple, if you can imagine, legal actions of the creditors going after her money. Nellie, their daughter, is sent to Switzerland. The other sister of Roosevelt is a physician there. She goes there to high school, gymnasium, falls in love there with a Jewish teacher from Palestine, comes back to United States just a month before the break of World War I. But in 1919, at urgence of Nellie, Rosa packs her and mother and daughter go to Palestine, and they arrive in Palestine in 1919. Rosa would never resume medical practice there, but from the first year she becomes a president of Palestine's Jewish Women Equal Rights Association. She lobbies Brits in London, in Palestine, for women's right to vote. In 1920, legislation passed the same year that in the United States. She lobbies British administrators of Palestine for legislation against child marriage. And if you look at the date, in 1933, speaks passionately, 1933, this is still very early, in front of the League of Nations in Geneva against persecution of Jews in Germany. She would die in 1938 and is buried in Geneva, Switzerland. So when I look at Rosa's life, perhaps not the happiest life, but definitely reminiscent of medical globetrotters, her cousins and brothers, male cousins and brothers, seizing opportunity about education, traversing countries, in her case continents, and deep interest not only in their own life, but also in the life of broader community or society, if you will. Well, let's leave the Welt family aside. Let's come back to finish in Galicia. Well, in Galicia also there is a debate about what to do with those pesky women. They want to go to the universities, and universities are closed. Here is the voice for, this is the voice against. Well, in 1900, finally, Vienna relents, and women are allowed to study medicine, pharmacy, and philosophy. Law is still closed until the post-World War I period. Well, you won't be surprised that in two Galician universities, one in Lwów, another in Kraków, the first women who would enroll would be Jewish women. And we are not talking about one woman, we are talking about women in plural sense. Maria Kalmus-Schneider becomes the first locally educated Jewish woman, and a woman in general, who would in 1904 graduate from Lwów University as a doctor. She is followed by many other names. Let me introduce to you only two women, just to contrast a little bit. Matilda Lateiner, there I put this Steve for you. This is Matilda Lateiner that we spoke over the phone. Again, from the records you could find where Matilda was born in Galicia, who was her father. In fact, when I noticed this, I discovered her uncles, grandfathers in our database. We find a little bit about education. We discovered that she graduated as a second woman from Lwów University. From her records, we can clearly see that she was a rising star. This is the time where professors were still skeptical about those women. Those women are taking only spots in the universities. And yet, Matilda attains very high grades. She works for a few years in Lwów University and then moves to Vienna, where she marries her fellow pediatricians, Ernst Meyerhofer, and the couple would settle in then Yugoslavia, in Zagreb, Croatia. And out of all places, this is the place where the couple would survive the war, and she died there in 1961. Another woman from this roster of Jewish women is Fanny Fuchs. She was a local girl from Lwów. You could see again the same information from her records. Fanny practiced her entire life in Lwów. She practiced her medicine in Jewish hospital in Lwów. You could see here this building just years after it was opened at the beginning of 20th century. I like the architecture of this building very much because it's built in a style, Moorish style, very commonly associated with many religious and non-religious sites within Jewish community of Germany, Austria, and Galicia. This building still stands till today. So this is the place where Fanny Fuchs practiced. By the way, the street by which this building is standing today is called Jacob Rappaport Street, the physician that I was telling you about. When we come to darker time, this is a medical questionnaire, or this is a questionnaire filled by Fanny Fuchs when Germans arrived in 1941. She and thousands of other Jews would be locked in the ghetto. One of the survivors that turned out was my neighbor, not far away from where we lived outside Philadelphia. That's how he described her in his memoirs. She always had a smile and a good and encouraging word, while she herself struggled hard. In August of 1942, Fanny Fuchs Reich would be dragged from her bed and perish like thousands of others. So as I try to come back to that period of Austrian Galicia and put together the story of these unique Jewish students who travel to faraway countries, then about Jewish barber surgeons who want to become properly trained, university-trained doctors, medical rebels, and then the story of women. If I try to put this together, it is worth to remind ourselves, when the Austrian Galicia was born in 1772, vast majority of Jews received basic education in traditional headers. The group of university-trained physicians was small. When we leave Galicia in 1918, this is the year of the end of World War II, of Austro-Hungarian Empire, and end of Austrian Galicia, this territory would become part of independent Poland. If we look at 1918, at two Galician universities, Lwów and Kraków, about 30% of students are Jewish. And this is in a context that Jews comprise roughly 10-11% of overall population in 1918. But if we want to talk about numerical overrepresentation, even more striking are numbers about women. In 1918, 50% of female medical students are Jewish. So I want to leave you with those numbers in mind, and I hope that I not only convince you that this is a story important to tell, but also that study of academic records, school records, provides a rich resource for our genealogical pursuits. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
When the Jewish medical students left the universities and went back to their towns to practice, did they set up their own Jewish hospitals, or were they able to work with the other hospitals in town?
Very good question. Thank you, Steve. Both. So we do see number of Jewish graduates all the way through the very early period of time, like Jacob Rappaport, who would be practicing across ethnic and religious divide. Very devout Jewish man. He would practice across. Jewish hospital you find even in an earlier period of time. This relates to the protection of Jewish dietary laws. So we do see Jewish hospitals in even small towns at the times before Jews were admitted to universities. Of course, after they graduated, many of them would practice in Jewish hospitals, but not exclusively. They would practice in both open practices as well as Jewish hospitals.
Were the Jewish women doctors treating women and men, or just women?
Excellent question, too. So I'll answer this on two levels, because one thing I forgot to mention. So why Austrian government suddenly allowed women in 1900 to enter the universities to study medicine? Now, of course, there was a public pressure, no question about that. But the second reason was that in Austro-Hungary, there was one province, Bosnia, that was predominantly Muslim. And Muslim women could not be examined by the men. Now answering your question, outside Bosnia, of course, they treated both. The Jewish women or women physicians treated both, men and women. Many of them, in fact, one maybe follow-up question, many of them became dentists. At that time, there were no separate dental schools. You became dentists after additional training, after you finished medical diploma.
A related question.
Yes.
In Lemberg, I think you mentioned that synagogue as progressive
Yes.
in the terms that day. Was that the synagogue where the rabbi was subject to an assassination attempt?
Yes.
It became very well publicized.
Yes, so thank you for that. So progressive synagogue, yes, the first initially teacher of religion and later on rabbi was Abraham Kohn, who was assassinated in September of 1848. He was poisoned. This was a part of the cultural and religious and also financial struggle between Orthodox community and so-called progressive community. But yes.
Thank you. Two questions, if I may. The first relates to the professionalization of medical dental education. As you know, in the United States, it was a chemistry professor from Columbia, whose name escapes me now, whose commission was accepted, and that professionalized medical education. Dental education also was around that time. I think early 20th century. So what is it seems to me that the corresponding date in this area of Central Europe was much earlier. My other question is about the leadership, the backgrounds of the medical school graduates from the Jewish communities. You mentioned early on how, I think it was, forget the name now, Dr. was the head of the, the one who was even earlier, who was head of the Vada Abra Ratzos. He may not have been a Rav, but he was clearly, engaged in the traditional Jewish community. Another person you mentioned from an earlier period, whose name I would appreciate you mentioning again, was actually a rabbi, physician, as...
Joseph Salomon Del Medigo.
Joseph Salomon,
yes,
thank
yes,
you. Del Medigo.
Yes,
Del Medigo. I wasn't sure it was Del Medigo.
Yes.
So was that model ever, and that was the traditional model, Maimonides,
That's very traditional, yes.
It's not everybody. So
Yes.
was that in the period when education was opened, were there
Rabbi physicians?
were there rabbi physicians in people who did not leave the observance of their community, but became physicians too? So two questions, if I may.
This is a very important question. So thank you. Let me maybe try to answer the second question, because I think it's a very deep question. So the short answer is no. When you became university-trained physicians, but you can broaden this to lawyers and later to other professions. Of course, temptations of conversions were higher, but no, we have multiple examples of very observant Jewish male and female physicians who remain very faithful and very deeply embedded in their traditional community. In fact, in June of last year,
The answer is yes. What do you mean by no?
that they did not depart from the traditional community. In fact, in June of last year, we published a little article in our research journal, Galician, where besides describing records, we tap very much to the audiences like you, tapping to the information about family members whose records we find. And one of the women physicians was from a very small town in Eastern Galicia. So now we are talking about someone who graduated not at the beginning of 19th century, but 1920s, let's say, who was deeply involved in Zionist movement and deeply involved in a traditional life of the community. Now, in terms of the model of a rabbi physician, I want to address this too, because this is a wonderful story. This model existed in much earlier times and not everywhere in Europe. The most harmonious coexistence of being a medic and a rabbi existed in Italy. Italian Jews very often were not only rabbis, but also physicians. Now, again, I'm talking about the late Middle Ages and early modern period. when I was describing University of Padua. And in fact, those simple Jewish boys who were coming from Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, how did they survive in this foreign land? Well, they were surviving very often because those rabbi physicians had a hostel, had a place of some support for those men arriving from apart. Farther east you start to go, to Germany and to particularly Poland. That coexistence of becoming a rabbi and physician becomes looser. In fact, in many Jewish statutes from German communities, it says, well, you have to separate those things. Now, there are still some rabbi physicians, and so farther east you go, more separation you see between the model of that you describe.
Could you elaborate what you mean by separate those things?
Well, there were, for example, statutes in one of the German towns saying that you could not hold community leadership position, you cannot be member of the community council, kahal, and a physician, and only you could become if you were older than 65 years of age, retirement age. So that's one of the examples, yes.
Question, what was the disposition of the Jewish hospital in Lwów when the Nazis came in?
Well, so let's put this in a timeline a little bit. So the war breaks in 1939, September 1939, 17th of September of 1939, Soviet Russia attacks and seizes control of Lwów and the eastern part of Galicia. Jewish hospital continued to exist during the Soviet period between 1939 and 1941 when Germans arrived. And within weeks, Jewish nurses, Jewish physicians, Jewish patients are removed from that hospital. There would be created clinics within the boundaries of ghetto, and there would be two, I think, Jewish hospitals in ghetto as well, but not in the building that I was showing you.
So what happened to that building?
It's a maternity hospital till today.
Sorry?
It's a maternity hospital until.
Maternity. But
Yeah.
But then the Nazis converted to a maternity, or did they just establish it as a place for themselves?
As a place for themselves, but not even as a hospital. If I remember correctly, there were some officers. The only Soviets, when they returned in 1944, re-established this as a maternity hospital. Of course, nothing related to the Jewish hospital.
And when were quotas instituted for Jews?
Right.
In general?
So the question is about the quotas for admission of Jewish students to the university. So in early 1930s, there is a rise of anti-Semitism. That's where many Polish universities would witness riots, disturbances. Universities are even closed. The right-wing, anti-Semitic youth organizations agitate against admission of Jewish students. And in 1930s, mid-1930s, well, even early, 1933, you begin to see dwindling number of Jewish students. Again, in this article from June of last year in the Galicianer, we provide detailed statistics. I'll give you just one number. So you remember I mentioned at the end of Austrian Galicia, but also in 1920-22, when there was independent Poland already, about 30% of students were of from Jewish community. If you look at the number of Jewish students admitted, the last year before the war, in 1938, there would be none in Jagiellonian and only 3 students we found in our records newly admitted in Lwów. So 1930s is continuous reduction. First is a limit to 10%, and later on is absolute ban on Jewish students.
I know because my father wound up in France.
Yeah.
He became a French officer.
Yes, yes. Many Jews at this period of time of 1930s, and again, that comes with the genes, would travel somewhere else. Many traveled to Prague, to German and Czech University. Many traveled to Vienna, still to Vienna. Of course, in 1936, the travel to Vienna stops. But the Prague University is open to Polish Jews or Galician Jews, if you will, until 1939. In fact, one of the amazing things that you can find from those records, when we were looking at the Jewish students from Prague University, from Galicia, we found one, I forgot his name, it's in this article in June of last year, who sits to the final exams on a day when Nazi troops enter Prague, and is granted diploma within the next few days. The last Jewish student that we found, in fact, Steve, it was from Nadburna student, born in Nadburna, was granted diploma in Prague University in June of 1939. Remember, at that time, there is no independent Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia. It is a German protectorate. Here we have maybe one question. Yeah,
Just one
yeah,
more
please. Yeah.
You mentioned about conversion. Was there a lot of pressure in Central Europe, especially German-speaking lands, for physicians to convert, either to get into medical school or to continue practice? I know Freud was one, of course.
Yeah.
But
Particularly in Germany, yes, definitely there were pressures toward conversions, maybe not to get to the university, but there were certain temptations once you left traditional community. Yes, many. And in fact, even if we look at the period of 18th century, even 17th century, one of the Jewish physicians not from Galicia, but from Ukraine, we were talking before the lecture about this, who went initially to Germany and later to Padua, would write in his book, warning parents, you better immerse your children in a learning of Torah before you send them to the universities. So yes.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for your talk. It's kind of important to me personally. I was born in a hospital in Krakow in 1946, and I think that the doctor was Jewish.
Most likely.
I also wanted to ask you about the Reform movement, which is a bit off topic. Was the Reform movement in other places besides Lwów in the 19th century, or was
I'm sorry, I didn't get.
I'm sorry, is there other places in Galicia other than Lwów? Was there a reform synagogues?
Okay. Yeah, yes. Well, we have to be careful with the word reform. It's called progressive. I would say we have to probably, this is the closest to maybe conservative Judaism. So the question is, were there religious reforms outside Lwów? Yes. They were not as common as in Germany, of course. But you might be surprised that the very first, we are now learning about this, that the first reform, conservative, kind of in a loose terms, use this term, a synagogue opened in a little town, well, it's not that little, but small town of Tarnopol, in a very east of Galicia. There was a teacher there, a wealthy man. He came from a merchant family, but he was very devoted to providing education to Jewish community. He opened school. Joseph Perl was his name. And in 1813, so the school opens in 1813, around 1815, he sets a synagogue in his private home. In fact, due to his influence in 1839, one of the biggest names among the movement of Galician Enlightenment, Solomon Yehuda Rappaport, again, a lot of Rappaports, is appointed a rabbi, a non-Orthodox rabbi in Tarnopol. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, so answering your question, so Lemberg, Tarnopol, Stanisławów, Tarnów, Kraków, these were the sites of religious reform.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.